It's just
TSA
scrap metal.
agent
Clean it
tossed
up.
a veteran's medals.
This piece
10
of scrap
minutes
metal
later,
was
the
exchanged for the
Secretary
blood
of
and
Defense
bones of my
arrived.
brothers.
Sir, it's just trinkets. Keep the line moving. The metal lid clanged against plastic as the TSA tray slammed forward, the old cigar box popping open mid-slide. Bronze and purple spilled out like a pocket full of daylight. Ribbons, stars, a folded strip of faded unit tape skittering across the conveyor in the harsh fluorescence of Southgate International. Heads turned. The young agent who'd barked the order, name tag reading Trent, smirked as if he'd just swatted a fly. Henry Dalton didn't smirk. He didn't speak. He bent one knee to the cold tile and gathered what had been earned under desert suns and monsoon skies. The Purple Heart's amethyst winked once under the belt scanner. The bronze star rocked and settled, as steady as a heartbeat. 2 campaign medals, Vietnam and Desert Shield, touched and chimed. Bright coins from a country that spends courage like currency and then forgets the receipt. Sir, liquids in a separate bin, Trent added, bored, while the 2 agents beside him chuckled. And maybe leave the Halloween costume jewelry at home. A flight attendant in Navy, Lana Rivera, froze 10 feet away with a stack of boarding passes. Something in the way the old man handled each piece, thumb against ribbon, forefinger on pin, the small pause before he returned it to the box, stopped her mid-step. Respect has a posture, and so does grief. She knew both when she saw them. Henry rose. Force Recon had taught him to travel light, a suit bag, the box, an invitation to a memorial in D.C., nothing else. He locked the lid, nodded once, and moved on without a word. The belt hummed. The agents laughed. The line shuffled forward, eyes sliding off the moment like rain off glass. Lana watched him walk to gate B12 and sit alone beneath a flickering departures board. Her jaw tightened. She pulled out her phone, not for a video, not for outrage points, but for a number she'd been given years ago after volunteering on a casualty assistance team. If you ever see something that dishonors a service member, the woman had told her, call me first. At B12, Henry set the box on his lap and rested both hands on it, as if warming them on a small, stubborn fire. The speakers crackled. Somewhere, a child laughed. In the checkpoint behind him, Trent stretched, yawned, and reached for the next tray. The departure hall at Southgate International was built for efficiency, not reverence. Fluorescent light panels buzzed overhead, washing the gray terrazzo floors in a pale glow. Coffee kiosks hissed steam and burned beans, the smell of caffeine and impatience thick in the air. Business travelers in tailored suits scrolled phones as if nothing beyond the stock ticker existed. Families herded children with the weary cadence of seasoned nomads. Yet inside Gate B12, time seemed to stagger, broken by the quiet gravity of one man and his battered box. Henry Dalton, 69 years old, carried himself like someone who had once learned to disappear in hostile terrain. His frame was lean, not wasted, wrapped in a brown wool sport coat frayed at the elbows. His close-cropped hair was snow white, but the set of his jaw still belonged to Force Recon. When he folded his hands over the box, knuckles scarred from both tools and combat, it looked less like resting and more like guarding. Every gesture, precise, contained, deliberate, carried the echo of a soldier who had spent decades obeying discipline when the world around him dissolved into chaos. Most people didn't notice. Some glanced, registered only tired old man, and turned back to their screens. The TSA agents behind the checkpoint carried on, jokes spilling like cheap beer. Only two sets of eyes truly mark the scene. Lana Rivera, still clutching her flight manifest, and a boy of maybe 9 seated across the aisle. The boy whispered something to his mother, who hushed him quickly, embarrassed. But he kept looking at the cigar box on Henry's lap, curiosity outweighing etiquette. Sarah, a middle-aged gate agent with a bright scarf tied at her throat, checked boarding passes as if the whole episode hadn't happened. Years in customer service had taught her the first rule of airports: keep the line moving, avoid trouble, smile on schedule. Yet she too found her gaze straying, unwilling, toward the man at B-12, and the way his shoulders sloped, not in defeat, but in endurance. At the far end of the hall, the automatic glass doors slid open with a sigh. A hush rippled in a few pockets, not of recognition, but of instinct. Margaret Holston did not move like a traveler. The Secretary of Defense moved like someone who expected a corridor to clear and found that it usually did. She wore a navy coat, unbuttoned, revealing the tailored lines of authority. No entourage, no flanking press. Her stride was clipped, direct, boots striking the terrazzo in a cadence that reminded Henry, when he looked up, of a drill field morning decades ago. Holston had once been a soldier's daughter. She had buried her own father with medals folded in velvet. And when Lana's call reached her, she had diverted her path without ceremony. For all her meetings, briefings, motorcades, she understood something elemental. There are moments when the machinery of government must stop for one human being. The hall did not know her name yet, but it felt her presence. Passengers parted unconsciously as she walked, their chatter thinning. She did not scan the gate or seek the TSA line. Her eyes fixed immediately on Henry Dalton, on the box in his lap, the posture of vigilance, and she adjusted her stride to intersect with him alone. Henry, startled, half rose. Old instincts demanded he stand when confronted by rank, by command presence. Holston lifted a gloved hand slightly. "Sit, Sergeant Dalton," she said quietly, voice low enough that only the nearest rose caught it. "You've stood enough." The ripple of recognition spread then. Whispers, gasps, the sudden flurry of phones angled discreetly. The Secretary of Defense was at Gate B-12, addressing a Marine veteran by name. Sarah, the gate agent, froze mid-swipe of a boarding pass. The boy across the aisle gaped, eyes wide, the way only a child can look when the world tilts into myth. Holston did not acknowledge the crowd. She reached into her bag and drew out a slim wooden case, polished walnut with brass hinges, engraved with a single name, Henry Dalton. She placed it gently on the seat beside him. "Sir," she said, "these deserve a home worthy of what they cost." Around them, the terminal dimmed into silence. The hum of announcements faded, the hiss of espresso machines muted. It was as though every ear strained to catch the words, and Henry, fingers trembling despite the years of control, opened the walnut lid to see velvet slots waiting, precise, for each metal in his battered tin. The old Marine's throat closed. He had not asked for ceremony, had not spoken a word in defense of himself. But now, in the indifferent current of airport travel, the balance of respect shifted like a tide. The silence at Gate B-12 should have held. Respect should have lingered long enough for Henry to breathe. But silence rarely survives arrogance. From the checkpoint, Trent, the TSA agent who had tossed the box, noticed the cluster of attention forming around the old man. He leaned toward his colleague, muttering with a grin, "What's this? A reunion for Grandpa's coin club?" The other agent chuckled, but the laughter died when Holston's profile came into view. Authority has a gravity, and even the blind can feel it. Still, Trent pushed on, unable to sense the precipice beneath his feet. He raised his voice, careless and sharp, slicing into the reverent hush. "Hey, old-timer, you gonna hold up the boarding with your antiques? We've got flights to catch, not parades to attend." The words landed like a slap. Passengers flinched. The boy who'd been staring wide-eyed at Henry's box turned his head sharply, confusion and shame flooding his small features. Sarah, the gate agent, pressed her lips tight, torn between protocol and outrage. Lana Rivera, fists clenched at her side, took a half-step forward but stopped, knowing she had already lit the fuse by making the call. Henry did not answer. He had trained too many years to let provocation dictate his response. Instead, he laid one medal into the velvet case, deliberate, silent. The bronze star gleamed under fluorescent light, a sharp rebuttal to mockery. Holston turned. Her gaze found Trent, unhurried, as if she'd already known where to look. The young agent froze mid-smirk. The crowd had begun to murmur now, whispers like a rising wind. Phones lifted, recording, transmitting. Public shame has its own gravity, and it was drawing him in fast. Still, pride twisted his mouth. "What? I'm just saying everybody's got junk in their attic. Doesn't make it special." That was the breaking point. A man in the corner, grizzled and weathered in a leather bomber jacket, stood. His voice rasped with years of cigarettes and sandstorms. "That junk is the reason you get to stand there mouthing off instead of kneeling in some ditch overseas." Murmurs became gasps, then applause. A woman with silver hair dabbed her eyes. The boy clapped his small hands without quite knowing why, only that something sacred had been desecrated and needed defending. Henry kept his head bowed, sliding the Purple Heart into its place. But his silence was no longer the silence of endurance. It was the silence of witness. Others were speaking for him now, strangers galvanized by insult. That was a Marine's gift, too. He could absorb the blow so others would rise. Holston stepped fully into the moment. Her voice was calm, resonant, cutting through the terminal like a drill sergeant's call across parade ground. "What you just threw on that conveyor belt," she said, eyes pinned to Trent, "was not junk. It was courage cast in bronze, blood crystallized in purple, and years carved out of a man's life so that you could wear that uniform of authority without ever knowing the cost." Trent's smirk faltered. His colleagues shifted uneasily. The phones caught every syllable. Holston's gaze softened only when she turned back to Henry. "And what you just endured, Sergeant Dalton, was indignity. That ends now." She knelt, not as a politician, but as a soldier's daughter, and slid the last medal into its place. The hush was complete again, broken only by the swell of clapping that rose unstoppable this time like surf against a seawall. Trent shrank back, face pale. His authority, paper-thin, dissolved under the weight of hundreds of eyes. He muttered something about policy, but no one listened. Respect had shifted. The crowd had chosen its side. Henry, hands folded once more, raised his eyes at last. They were damp but steady. He did not look at Trent. He looked at the boy across the aisle, the child whose small voice had been silenced by his mother's hush minutes earlier. He gave the boy a single nod, subtle but sure, a Marine's acknowledgement that dignity had been defended not by retaliation, but by endurance. The child's face lit up, and in that light, The balance of the hall tilted fully away from mockery into reverence. Henry Dalton had never intended for strangers to know the weight of the box he carried. To them it might look like trinkets, bits of ribbon and metal, but each piece was a fragment of a story he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Now, sitting at Gate B-12 with the Secretary of Defense beside him, the murmurs of the crowd still washing like surf against the glass walls, he felt the memories press forward. Silence, he realized, would no longer do. Holston rested a hand lightly on the case. "Sergeant, these deserve to be known," she said quietly, but firmly enough that those standing nearby leaned closer. "Tell them." Henry's eyes drifted to the Purple Heart, its surface nicked from years of travel. He inhaled slowly. "Ramadi, 2006, he began. His voice was gravel but steady. "Convoy escort through a narrow street. The first blast took the Humvee in front of us, shrapnel everywhere. We thought it was over, then the secondary charge went off under our wheels. Fire, steel, screaming. I remember the taste of dust and blood, and the weight of my radio operator slumped across my chest. The gate fell utterly still. The chatter of other terminals seemed far away. Passengers leaned on their suitcases, transfixed. Even Trent, pale and sweating, could not move. Henry gestured toward the Bronze Star. There were 2 kids trapped in the back, ammunition cooking off. I pulled them out before the fire rolled. By the time I carried the last one clear, I didn't have much left of this arm." He lifted his sleeve slightly. Scars, pale and twisted, spoke louder than his words. "Doctors told me I'd never use it again. They were wrong, but only partly." He paused, swallowing hard. "What I never said, not even at the VA, was this. I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of surviving while my friends didn't. Every medal in this case feels less like an honor and more like a gravestone I carry around." Holston's eyes softened, but she did not interrupt. She knew the power of letting a soldier finish his own sentence. Henry continued, "When I came home, there was no parade, just silence. A job at a machine shop, then layoffs, bills stacking higher than courage could reach. My wife left after 5 years of watching me wake screaming in the night. My boy stopped calling, so I did what a lot of us do. I folded in on myself, lived small, carried the box like ballast so I wouldn't drift completely off the map." The crowd shifted. Some nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. A man in a business suit pressed a palm to his mouth. The silver-haired woman dabbed at her cheeks again. Henry's gaze dropped to the small unit insignia nestled between the medals. "That one," he said softly, "wasn't even official. Local craftsman in Saigon back when my father wore the uniform in Vietnam. He gave it to me the day I deployed, said, 'Remember, son, we fight for each other, not the brass, not the flag, each other.' I carried it through every tour. It's all I have left of him." The hush deepened, reverence now absolute. For the first time, Henry's voice broke. "I thought the world had forgotten that maybe we'd become nothing more than old men in diners with stories nobody wanted to hear." Holston straightened, her presence commanding yet tender. "Sergeant Dalton," she said, her words carrying to every corner of the gate, "the world forgets only when men like you stop reminding it. Today, you reminded them." The boy who had been staring earlier whispered to his mother, loud enough to be heard, "Mom, he's a real hero." Henry shook his head gently. "No, heroes are the ones who didn't come back." He looked at the child directly. "I'm just the one still carrying their names, phones captured it all. The tremor in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, the silence that held the room like sacred ground. What began as humiliation at a conveyor belt had become testimony, an unveiling of scars that medals alone could never explain. Holston rose, and with a motion both symbolic and deeply personal, she saluted. Not the crisp, parade ground salute of politics, but the steady, solemn gesture of one soldier's child to another's sacrifice. Slowly, others in the gate rose too. Veterans in the crowd lifted trembling hands to their brows. Civilians mimicked awkwardly, some with tears streaming. Henry remained seated, overwhelmed. But inside, something long sealed began to ease. For 18 years, he had borne his story like a wound that must never be exposed. Now it had been spoken aloud, and instead of ridicule, he found respect, raw, unvarnished, and undeniable. The box before him no longer seemed heavy. It seemed shared. The applause lingered like distant thunder as Henry lowered his gaze. He had not asked for this stage, nor the sudden audience that now hung on every breath he took. Yet something inside him shifted. For years he had stayed quiet, carrying scars and medals alike as private burdens. But silence, he realized, had been mistaken for weakness. This moment demanded a different answer. Secretary Holston placed the box back into Henry's lap and leaned closer. "Sergeant," she murmured, "you don't have to say anything else if you don't want to." Henry exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "No," he said louder now, his voice carrying across the gate. "For too long, I kept my head down, thought it was safer that way. But if we don't speak, people like that," he gestured toward Trent, who shrank visibly, "start thinking they can throw our history in a bin like it's nothing." The words cut through the room, plain but undeniable. Trent opened his mouth, then closed it again. His fellow TSA agent stood rigid, unsure whether to intervene or slink away. Henry stood. At 6 feet tall, with shoulders still square despite age, his presence filled the space. "I don't need pity," he said. "I don't need applause. I need one thing, for every man and woman who wore this uniform to be treated with basic respect." The statement landed heavy. A ripple of nods spread among the passengers. A businessman lowered his phone, visibly ashamed that he had once joined in the laughter. An elderly woman whispered, "Amen." Holston stepped back deliberately, ceding the floor to him. This was not about political speeches. It was about a Marine finding his voice again. Henry pointed gently at the child who had called him a hero. "You asked if I'm one," he said. "I'll tell you the truth. I survived. That's all. But survival comes with a responsibility. It means speaking when silence is easier. It means carrying names that don't get called at boarding gates anymore." His voice broke for a moment, but he steadied. "It means never letting anyone forget." The child's mother put an arm around her son, tears in her eyes. Around the terminal, people shifted uncomfortably, confronted with the simple weight of his words. Trent suddenly snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know what was in the box? It's just my job." Henry fixed him with a look that silenced the excuse mid-air. "It's not about the box," he said firmly. "It's about how you treat people you don't understand. That's the measure of respect, not when you know their story, but when you don't." The hush was absolute. Even the announcements over the PA seemed to hold back. Holston then addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Dalton just gave you more than a story. He gave you truth, and I will ensure it's heard not only here, but in every corner of our nation's security system. The turning point had arrived. A man once mocked now stood as the moral center of an impromptu courtroom, the verdict rendered not by law but by conscience. Henry felt no triumph, only clarity. Silence was no longer his refuge. His voice was his weapon, and respect his battlefield. The gate area had become a tribunal, not of stone walls and gavels, but of conscience and memory. Henry stood at its center, medals gathered once more in their case, a silent reminder of lives lived and lost. What had begun as humiliation had grown into something larger, an unmasking of values, of dignity, of what was owed to those who had borne the battle. Trent shifted from one foot to another. His TSA badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but his authority had evaporated. Passengers filmed openly now, their cameras steady, not to shame Henry, but to capture the reckoning of a man who had tried to belittle him. Henry's eyes met Trent's. They were not angry eyes, nor cruel. They were steady, carved by deserts and jungles and years of carrying more than one man should. "You wanted to make me small," Henry said, his voice low but resonant. "But I am not small, not because of medals or wars, but because of the people who stood beside me. Every stripe on my sleeve, every scar, every folded flag, it's not mine alone. It belongs to them." Trent swallowed hard, his throat visibly working. He tried again. I didn't mean—" "Intentions are smoke," Henry interrupted. "Actions are fire. And today, your actions showed contempt, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever worn this uniform. That's not something you laugh away." Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. A veteran in a wheelchair raised a trembling hand and called out, "Tell him, brother." The words carried the weight of solidarity, and Henry inclined his head respectfully. Holston stepped forward now, her presence commanding as the nation's highest defense official. But she did not overshadow Henry. She amplified him. "Sergeant Dalton speaks the truth," she said. "Respect is not optional. It is the foundation upon which every free moment in this terminal rests. And when someone like him is mocked, the insult stains us all." She turned deliberately toward Trent. "What you did today will follow you, not because the internet saw it, but because your own conscience will. You will remember the moment you tossed aside sacrifice as though it were luggage, and you will remember the silence that followed when Sergeant Dalton chose to speak." The young man's face collapsed inward. Shoulders hunched, eyes darting, he seemed to shrink under the weight of every lens and every stare. But Henry raised a hand, halting further humiliation. "I don't want your job," he said simply. "I don't want revenge. I want you to understand. One day, you may hold someone's memory in your hands. A box, a photo, a folded flag. Treat it as if your own father's blood stained it, because for someone it does." The gate was silent save for the hum of overhead lights. The moment hung suspended, fragile and electric. Then, slowly, passengers began to rise. First the boy and his mother, then the elderly couple, then businessmen, students, soldiers in plain clothes. One by one, they stood in recognition, not commanded, not rehearsed. It was instinct, the ancient gesture of a people acknowledging sacrifice. Applause began softly, a tentative rhythm, then built into thunder. It rolled across the concourse, swelling until even the loudspeakers announcing flight delays seemed drowned beneath it. Some saluted, some placed hands over hearts, others simply bowed heads. Henry stood motionless, the storm of sound breaking over him. His instinct was to retreat, to wave it down, to vanish back into the anonymity he had worn like armor. But another instinct held stronger, to let the recognition flow past him, not for himself, but for those unseen, men and women who had not lived to feel it. Tears traced the lines of his face. He whispered names under his breath, old names, brothers lost in jungles and deserts. Each clap of hands became in his mind a bell rung in their memory. Holston stepped beside him, raising her voice over the thunder. "This," she declared, "is what respect looks like. This is what we owe." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a slim black case embossed with the seal of the Department of Defense. Opening it, she removed a challenge coin, large, heavy, engraved with the eagle and shield. She pressed it into Henry's palm. "You gave more than we can repay," she said, "but let this remind you, your nation still sees you." Henry closed his fingers around the coin, feeling its weight, not as payment, but as acknowledgement. He nodded once, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Then he turned, not to Holston, not to Trent, but to the boy who had called him a hero. Kneeling slightly to meet his eyes, Henry said, "You asked me once. Now I'll answer differently. I'm no hero. But if you remember what happened today, if you grow up to treat people with honor, maybe you will be." The boy nodded solemnly, as if receiving an oath. His mother wept quietly beside him. The climax had crested. Trent was broken, the crowd transformed, and Henry, who had entered as a silent man carrying a battered box, now stood revealed, not a relic of past wars, but a living witness to the enduring power of dignity. For the first time in years, Henry's chest felt light, not because the scars had healed, but because their story had been told and believed. Trent's composure gave way like glass under heat. The badge that had given him certainty an hour ago now felt radioactive against his chest. The laughter he'd offered at Henry's expense echoed back at him, warped, accusatory. He opened his mouth to defend himself. Policy, procedure, the pressure of the line. But the words snagged, flimsy against the side of a purple heart being lifted with white-gloved hands. "I didn't know," he managed, the syllables brittle. "I was just doing your job." The question came not from Henry, but from the older man in the wheelchair, the vet whose hand had trembled when he raised it. His voice was gravel and road dust. "Son, the job is to see people. You didn't." Trent's co-workers had drifted back, the way people drift toward a fire, cautious, drawn, fearful of the heat. One of them, the supervisor with the radio, shifted his gaze between the crowd and Trent with a dawning recognition that something fundamental had been breached. "Agent Trent," he said, quieter than protocol would require, "step aside." It wasn't a suspension. It was a severing. The crowd's allegiance had already moved. A line formed, not to protest, not to jeer, but to reach Henry. A pilot in a Navy blazer shook his hand, lips pressed thin to hold back emotion. A college kid with a backpack asked softly if he could carry the new case to Henry's gate. A woman in a blazer, airport operations, offered a quiet apology for the terminal, as if apologizing for the whole country's moments of forgetfulness. "Sir," Trent whispered to Henry when their eyes finally met again, "I'm sorry." He meant it. The bravado had burned off, leaving only the stark outline of a young man who had not understood the weight of what he'd touched. Henry let the apology rest in the air without snatching it. Take care of the next person, he said. That's how you prove it. Holston didn't gloat. She didn't issue edicts or theatrics. She spoke to the supervisor in a tone that could bend steel without raising volume. Retraining, mandatory, not a slide deck, real training, led by veterans and Gold Star families, and a permanent display case here. Medals, flags, letters. People need to see what passes through their hands. The supervisor nodded, chastened, already radioing. The policy gears began to turn, not as retaliation, but as repair. And then, almost as if history had been waiting for the cue, an elderly woman stepped forward, palms cupped around a small velvet box. "My husband's," she said to Henry, voice trembling. "I was afraid to bring it through. I always hide it. Not anymore." She opened the box. A bronze star winked up at the fluorescent lights. The crowd shifted, making space around her the way you'd make space in a chapel. Trent watched, face drained, as the center of gravity moved irrevocably away from him, away from cynicism, toward reverence. The collapse wasn't cinematic. It was quiet. A head lowered, a badge unpinned, a young man learning the hard way which things are not to be handled lightly. When Henry finally turned to go, coin in pocket, case in hand, the crowd parted as if along an honor guard. Trent stayed where he was, hands empty, newly aware of the weight he had failed to carry. The terminal had returned to its rhythm, yet something had shifted. Conversations hummed softer, eyes carried a quiet reverence, and even the sound of boarding announcements seemed gentler, as though the entire building had absorbed a lesson. Henry walked with the measured gait of a man who had carried more than luggage, the new case balanced in his hand like a reliquary. At the gate, children craned their necks to see him pass. One boy, no older than 10, tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Is he a hero?" The father bent low, eyes on Henry's back. "He served," he answered. "It was enough." The boy nodded, solemn, as if given a secret worth guarding. Holston lingered for a moment, her presence both commanding and invisible, the way true leadership works. "Mr. Dalton," she said, catching his arm lightly, "I'll see you again in Washington. Your voice is needed." She didn't mean at the podium alone. She meant in the corridors of policy, where memory fades fastest. Henry inclined his head, the humility of a Marine masking the quiet fire that still burned. "I'll be there." When she left, escorted by nothing but her own certainty, Henry sat down at the gate. The old case lay beside the new one, battered tin and polished wood, past and present side by side. He rubbed the scar on his wrist, a mark from Ramadi, and thought of the men who hadn't come home. The medals were theirs, not his. He carried them because they could not. Then a familiar face appeared, Lana, the flight attendant who had made the call. She crouched to eye level. "They'll board you first," she said softly. "Not because of policy, because it's right." Henry smiled, weary lines folding into gratitude. "You did more than you know," he told her. She only shook her head. "I just picked up the phone. You carried the weight." When boarding was called, the crowd did not rush. They held back, a spontaneous corridor forming. Henry walked through, not saluted by uniformed men, but honored by ordinary travelers, business people, students, families. Some clapped softly, others placed hands over hearts. It was not spectacle, it was communion. On the plane, as engines rumbled awake, Henry pressed his palm to the new case. His reflection in the polished wood merged with the engraved letters of his name. Outside, the runway stretched like a ribbon into morning light. He thought of the boy at the gate, of every young face that would inherit the world veterans had paid for. Maybe respect could be taught not by speeches alone, but by moments that burned into memory. As the aircraft lifted, Henry closed his eyes. He didn't hear applause anymore. He heard surf on distant shores, voices of friends long gone, and the steady beat of a promise still unbroken. Semper Fidelis. Always faithful, always